If you like the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment. For more videos like this, people who live in backwoods, deep forests, etc., what is your go-to story about encounters you've had in the deep woods, trails? In 2005, when I was little, I used to work with my father on tons of projects, and they always turned out great. However, this time we were working on a campsite for us to use at any time we wanted, for free. The night we finished, we used the campsite for the first time. We had nothing but bad luck. My dad hurt himself trying to open a package of hot dogs, and the fire wouldn't start. The whole forest was glowing in the dark when he cut the trees down, so we sat outside for the majority of the night. The next morning, we went back to the house. I was watching TV, and my dad went out to smoke. 1 minute later, he came back inside, white as a ghost. He told me that he saw a creature with a deer-like body, knives for legs, and the head of a goat. We stayed inside for that day. We kept the blinds shut and the door locked. The next day, we went outside, and there were cut marks in the ground where it stood. Since then, we have never camped anywhere near a spot again. This happened when I was only 16 and was with my father. We went to Yellowstone National Park. We went on a hike in the forest. My dad thought it was a good idea to go off trail just a little bit to see if we could see some deer, so I said sure, let's go. So we headed off into the forest. We probably walked for hours and didn't see anything, so we heard anything, and I'm being serious, not even a bird sound, so the wind it started to get dark, so we started to hike back, but we were lost. It's getting dark really fast, so my dad told me that we had to camp tonight and head home tomorrow. I said, okay, that's fine. We set up camp, but whiting wasn't much, just a fire. As we sat by the fire, we heard this scream just out of nowhere. It sounded like a girl screaming at the top of her lungs. What my dad didn't tell me was that he brought his .44 mag with him. He told me to stay put, so I did when he left. It's been about 20 minutes since he left. I'm getting really bored, and all of a sudden I see a figure come out of the woods. It's hunched over and has antlers, and it's tall, like 7 to 8 feet tall, and its arms are long. It walked up to me and sat down. Its eyes were blacked out, and it looked at me, and it started whispering something to me. At that point, my dad came running out of the woods and shot the monster. It screamed, just like the one we heard earlier in the day, and it ran at my dad, and my dad took another shot, and the monster jumped clean over my dad, and my dad's a big guy. It's about 6.5, so he's pretty big. After the monster ran back into the woods, my dad grabbed me, and we ran. We finally found our way back, and we hopped in the car and took off. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw it in the day like it looked just like a Wendigo. It screamed one more time, and it ran away. That's the last time I go to the woods. When I was younger, me and one of my buddies would find cool wooded areas to hike, and we would occasionally camp out in some of the areas. We ended up finding an interesting small island that was extremely close to the area we were in. You could walk through a few feet of water that was very shallow, and you would be there. We walked across and made it to this heavily wooded island. We found a spot close to the middle of the island. Like I said, it was very small, and it was too small for someone to live there. After we found the spot, we decided to camp out there. We walked back to the car and grabbed our tents and a few things that we would need. When we had gotten back to the island and set up camp, it was already getting dark. So we made a fire and were just hanging out. A little bit later, my friend turns to me and whispers, "Do you see that?" While pointing in the distance, a small beam of light was shining through the trees, and it then started to move around. It looked to be a flashlight that was shining. We had called out and gotten no response. Then my friend turns to me and tells me to just listen very carefully. There was absolutely no sound. This area was so heavily wooded that even taking a step would cause a lot of sound due to leaves and twigs crunching. My friend and I both reached for our flashlights and turned them on. The light that was shining through the trees turned off. We walked around the whole island and didn't find anyone. We were so scared that we left our camp and walked to the car. We ended up staying in the car for the night and getting everything from camp in the morning. It was summer, I was about 6 to 7 years old, and I was running around with no shoes on in my grandma's yard. As I was playing in the yard, I heard my grandma call my name from the woods, Comet. I stood there confused. I didn't see my grandma go into the woods, but she called again, Comet. I call back to her, "Granny, where are you?" She responds with my name again, and I respond back, "Hold on, let me put on my shoes." I run inside to go get my shoes on. As the door opens and I sit down to put them on, my grandma walks out of the kitchen and tells me lunch is almost ready. I stare at her, and she notices and asks me what's wrong. I ask her if she was just in the woods. She shakes her head, and I tell her she just called me from the woods. My grandma walks to the door as I say that, closes it, and locks it. She says to me, by far the creepiest thing for a kid to hear, if someone calls your name from the woods, never go to it. I say okay, and she says don't go back outside. I don't know what I heard that day, but since that day, I have heard my mom's voice, dad's, brothers, sisters, grandpas, aunts, uncles, friends, even my freaking unborn cousin at the time. I don't know what that means, but I'm scared and will never go in the woods looking for it. I'm a 46-year-old native Mainer who grew up in western Maine, Franklin County, as a veteran and lifelong construction worker. I am a believer in Sasquatch and extraterrestrial life. I have hunted and fished all over Maine and thought I had seen about every animal that the state had to offer until December 30, 2006. My workmate Cody and I had just finished up working for Reed and Reed on the Mars Hill Wind Project. We left the motel in Robinson around 8:30 a.m. and made our way to the interstate in Holton to head home to Livermore. We stopped before the interstate at a truck stop to get drinks and breakfast. Cody asked me to drive the first leg to Bangor, where he would finish driving from there. We got on 95 South. It was a bright, clear morning, and we began what was expected to be a mundane drive down the interstate home. For this time of year, there was not much snow, as we had had an unusually warm December. It was an uneventful drive until we got south of Oakfield, but still well north of Island Falls. Cody was dozing in the passenger seat, and I was having a fairly good time running 80 to 85 miles per hour. That's when I saw the creature emerge from the tree line on the northbound side of the interstate. As it came out of the trees, I saw it. It was upright, the color was brownish blonde, and it was big, bigger than any bear I've ever seen, but this was no bear. I estimate this creature was between 600 and 700 pounds, not only that, but it had a massive canted head and broad shoulders on it, and when fully exposed, it dropped to all four and ran like I've never seen any animal run. It didn't run or lope like a bear, its haunches stayed low, much like a silverback gorilla. It ran much the same, only with an extremely lengthy stride. I woke Cody immediately, asking him if he had seen it, and he had managed to get a glimpse. The entire sighting took maybe 12 to 14 seconds. The creature crossed the northbound lanes, the medium, and the southbound lanes in this amount of time. Once it had crossed the southbound lanes, it came to a tall rock face, to which it reached up, pulled itself over, and disappeared back into the trees seemingly effortlessly. Since then, with the advent of podcasts and videos, I've found what is commonly referred to as Dogman, aka Loup-Garou. So that's my encounter. It was brief and something I never want to meet up with again. I worked at a really remote archery range for a few summers. The hike to it is a mile back from our main campsite, which is in a remote location on a mountain to begin with, and went out early to set up. I got bored, so I decided to fire off a few shots of my own before the students arrived. I shot about 5 or 6 arrows before I noticed a man standing downrange. I immediately stopped what I was doing and called him to let him know he couldn't be there. People were coming. This was a firing range. Dude just stood there, but there was something about it that made my hair stand on end. He was an Alaska Native man with round eyes, a strong brow ridge, eyes shadowed by his eyebrows kind of look, a round jaw, and kind of bow-shaped lips. He was wearing a really basic kind of outfit, like a suede sack, with a tattered kind of edge on the bottom. Not at all like the elaborate things you usually see people in native dress wearing, no fur trim, no big stitching, no colorful beads, really just worn and plain, and kind of dirty. Dude was fairly tall. We had a really nice heavy backdrop to catch arrows 12 up, and he was pretty close to the line down the middle, so shy of 6 feet, but not by a lot. He wasn't as round as most of the natives I know. Dude was pretty thin, with his hair all back. It looked kind of like dreads, but wasn't, more like braids after they've been that way for a while and have started to get loose flyaways. Maybe a little matted. He just stood there. No acknowledgement. There was no change in his expression. He just had this really hard look, like he was maybe clenching his teeth. It freaked me out. Fortunately, I heard voices coming up the trail. I told him again that people were coming, and again, nothing. Then I asked if he needed me to call someone for him. He just vanished. Poof. Gone. We found out later that our property backed up against traditional native lands currently owned by a native corporation. I've always wanted to ask more about it, but I worked there for several years and never saw him again. I'm not really sure what I would even say or who I'd ask. I went to a camp when I was about 14. I'm an avid hiker and love to go backpacking, so I found a camp where we would do a 125-mile, 15-day trek over in Montana. After a 17-hour drive from Minnesota, we finally got there and got started on our hike. It all started out normal as could be, hard as hell as the first because it was all uphill and I had about a 50-pound pack, but after a couple days, we all started to get this weird feeling like something was just wrong. We assumed we were just homesick and kind of brushed it off. After about another day, we were taking a break, and it got damn near silent in the woods, and if you go camping in the woods, you should know this is not normal. Since we were in Montana, we assumed it was probably a bear, so we banged on some pots as we walked and had our bear spray ready, but we couldn't shake this uneasy feeling that we shouldn't be there. After we had finally gotten to the next site, we felt a bit better and set up our tents. All went fine until dinner time, when we saw a deer. It's Montana, so it's not surprising, but it was so skinny and looked like it had a broken leg. But it smelled like death and just looked plain wrong. We had managed to make enough noise to scare it off, but it didn't run off like its leg was hurting, just like it was fine. After that, we were all uneasy but exhausted and got ready to sleep, so we got in our tents and knocked out. I woke up to my tent mate Tyler shaking me, and before I could ask why, he pointed to the front of the tent. The moon was out, so we had good light, and I could see what looked like a deer through the tent canvas, but you could tell it was just off. Its body was freakishly long and seemed to be on 2 legs. It was just passing around the tents, making this disturbing chittering noise, which seemed plain wrong. After about 15 minutes of this, it finally seemed to have left, but the sound got unbearably loud for a few seconds before it went to the eerie quietness. Needless to say, we didn't go back to sleep. The next morning, we got the duck out of the area after seeing the tracks go from deer to something like a weirdly shaped foot. The rest of the trip was uneventful, but we couldn't shake the feeling of being watched until we got off the trail. Since this happened, I have not returned to the woods without some sort of firearm, and I can't shake the feeling of being watched no matter where up north I go. One night around 6 or 7 years ago, I had a cat with whom I was very close. But one night, I had my friend and my twin brother over. My cat got out one night, and this wouldn't be a big issue, but my family owns 200 acres of woodland. And it used to be Creek Native American land. But I get sidetracked, so me, my brother, and my friend all went out to look for the cat. But something was different about the night. It was very quiet to begin with. My 3 dogs were quiet but on guard. We ignored it while we looked for the cat. Not even the crickets were chirping. As we moved to the barn on our land at this point, all of my dogs were going crazy. Snarling, breaking, and growling. We were terrified, but we kept looking out of naive hope. As we searched the barn, the stench of death and skunk filled the air. As that filled the air, a turkey vulture perched and flapped its wings. It startled all of us. My 3 dogs, 1 Great Dane and 2 pit bulls, were going back wild. As the vulture swooped right over my head as it cleared my head, something grabbed it out of the sky. Now we all had flashlights. I had a headband light. As the vulture gets mauled right in front of my eyes by this massive black-haired creature in front of me, it looks up at me while having the guts of the vulture drip from its jaws. Its eyes reflected the light from its eyes. That's not what scared me the most, it had the face of a man and hair all over. I stood in fear and shock. In this moment, I pissed and shitted myself as I stared into its eyes. My friend yelled at me, and she grabbed me as we ran and jumped the gate to the barn. My brother was behind us and was unable to jump the gate. As I looked back, I saw my brother finally go through the gate, as he was almost killed by whatever his unathletic nature was. As we all ran into the house, we all confirmed what we saw. She spent the night with us. The next morning, we went back to find bloody footprints, but the one thing that disturbed us the most was that the bird's body parts were strung in the trees, which gave me nightmares. I've continued to see this thing several times. And I don't care if you think I'm crazy, I know what I saw, smelled, and felt. I'm not crazy. Several years ago, when I was 13 or 14, I was at a nature preserve in East Texas. My sister and I were walking the trails when we started to argue. We went separate ways, and I started to head back towards the entrance area. I was looking down the whole time, and all of a sudden I just stopped and looked up really fast. About 20 yards away from me was this giant shadow of a human-type figure. It was maybe 9 feet tall, and I couldn't make out any features. I could see the outline of its head and its really broad shoulders, and it looked like its arms were down by its side, but I couldn't see the legs. Even though it was about 2 p.m. in the summer and the sun was really bright, the figure was the darkest shade of black I have ever seen. I couldn't see the facial features, but I could tell it was staring back at me. We were both eerily still, just staring at each other for about a minute or so. I don't know how to describe it, but I was staring into its eyes without seeing its eyes. When I was looking at it, nothing was going through my mind. I just felt unsettled and nervous. Finally, my mind kind of snapped back to reality, and I started walking to the entrance, which was to the left of me, and up the long, winding hill. I was too scared to look back at it. When I finally got to the pavilion and got water, I felt calm. My sister came back about 15 minutes later, and we got in her car and left. I wasn't planning on telling her because I thought I was just crazy, but then she told me she saw the same thing. She was rounding a corner on one of the trails when she saw a black figure by the trees. She didn't look at it long enough to see the top half of it. My sister has been back on those trails, but I never will. I don't know if it's because I saw the whole figure and we were both staring at each other for a while or what. When I was a kid, I lived in Alabama. Way out in the country, my best friend at the time lived about a mile away, and my older brother and I would go over there daily during the summer. Near his property is a dead forest. All the trees are there, but they never had any leaves, so pretty damn creepy to begin with. Sometimes we played in there, but we never went very far. One day, my brother and my friend, let's call him Sam, wandered off while I was messing with a turtle and disappeared. I went around the property looking for them until I thought I saw one of them head into the woods. By this time, it was late afternoon and getting darker. I ran to the woods but couldn't see them, then I heard what sounded like them talking deeper in. I followed the voices, and they kept seeming further and further away, as I should have been getting closer. Then they stopped. And I felt really scared suddenly. At that moment, I realized the sun had already set and it was starting to get dark, so I ran all the way back to Sam's house. My older brother and Sam were playing Nintendo in his room, and I thought I was still in the backyard messing with the turtle. I never did figure out what I was chasing in those creepy woods. I have also had numerous other experiences with seemingly unnatural phenomena. I think somehow I attract it. A couple years ago, I experienced something really strange while bushwhacking in the deep wilderness in the northwestern Adirondacks. I'm a fisherman, always looking for remote ponds to find brook trout. This takes a lot of hiking back and forth, eyeing a body of water before rucking back to grab canoes and gear. I found a pond on a map and decided to hike out to it. Thankfully, I wasn't alone like I typically am on these trips, so at least one other person can attest. We found the pond and started walking around, checking the depth. Then this omnipresent growl permeated the forest. It was unexplainably deep, unlike anything I've ever heard before. I can only describe it as sounding like some creature in a horror film. It was loud, and again, it didn't seem to come from any particular direction but felt like it was right next to us. I've been exploring the ADK my entire life and live in a rural area just outside the park. There is no explanation for what we heard. Of course, adrenaline hit, and I was expecting a bear close by. We searched everywhere for the source of the sound and saw nothing. I was struck with a really weird feeling that just felt like I was really not wanted there. We booked out of the woods, looking in all directions as we fled, and there was nothing. It's just so damn weird, and I still think about it all the time. I live in Pennsylvania but occasionally visit southern Indiana to see my dad's side of the family. One time, about a year ago, I was hanging out with a friend, and he told me all about Lickford Bridge. I called BS, and we thought nothing of it, but later that night he asked if I wanted to go. I resisted at first, but eventually went. When we turned onto the road, I immediately felt intense dread. All that was around us was thick wood. Odd things started happening when we got onto the bridge that he would sacrifice his slaves under. First I heard a terrifying scream that came from the creek below the bridge, then a little further down the bridge I heard what seemed to be a cat screeching. At this point, I was already ready to go, but the road was dead end, so we had to turn around. We turned around and started back over the bridge. No noises were heard as we went back over it, but about a minute after we got off the bridge, a girl in the front seat yelled that she saw a red orb behind the car. So instinctively, I turned around to see, and I also saw the orb. It was a very dim light that you had to focus on to see it, but it was there. There were no road signs or reflective things to create that illusion. The orb followed us for a couple more minutes, and then it started to gain. When it got close, the car completely stalled. The driver, my friend's mom, tried to turn back on the car, but it didn't turn until about her fifth try. We continued down the road, driving way over the speed limit to get out of there. Then, later down the road, the orb started to gain again, but I wasn't looking. A girl yelled, "Oh my God, it's in the car," and the car instantly turned off. This time, it wouldn't turn back on for a minute or so. The orb didn't go away. In a video taken by my friend, you can see the orb and hear the most petrifying scream ever. Since there were rumored disappearances on that road, I thought for sure it was the end for me, but the mom did get the car started. For the rest of the ride, nothing else happened other than the orb keeping a steady distance from the car. The orb went away once we exited the road. When we got home, my friend and I decided to examine the car doors. There were multiple hand prints in places we wouldn't have touched while getting out of the car. I struggled to sleep that night, of course, but I finally fell asleep at around 3:30 in the morning. At 4 o'clock, I was ripped out of my sleep. The TV had been turned way up, and it just presented static and the very loud noise that accompanies static. Nobody else was awake, so it couldn't have been a prank. Everybody was freaked out. That could be a coincidence, but if so, it's a very timely coincidence. When I was about 10, I decided to go out with one of my friends. It was about 5 minutes to the forest. It was raining heavily the day before, so of course it was muddy. Me and my friends are very superstitious. The week before, we went on a trip when our school did forest school. We made forts and that. After a week, we went to check on them. Just me and my friend. A strong storm did happen the week before, so we did think it would be destroyed. But somehow, one of the weakest forts only had its front while the others had the roof. We laughed and made a dam after it flooded a bit. My friend didn't feel safe there. He said he wanted to stay there for 15 more minutes. I could see his fear. But we started to hear someone talk. It sounded like a radio. After it started, the wind got strong, and it got more muddy from nowhere. We panicked. Then, we saw this tall, black creature with a hat. Now I know you might call me crazy. But I'm not. I swear to God, I saw it 10 times. After we ran for our lives, we started walking to the fence to walk over. Then, we heard another person walking. We looked back and saw this creature again. And a blue version of it, but smaller. We ran, jumping over the fence. We thought we were safe. Then, after looking back, we jumped over the next fence so we could walk a bit further away. As I looked back, it was there again. Swapping back and forth. Like waving. I could see a faint smile. We jumped over, running. The wind was strong. My friend fell, almost snapping his leg. We found out that it was going to be a serious bruise. Blood covered his leg. Being idiots, we ignored it. We then forgot about it. The second we forgot about it, we heard a faint yell from a graspy, inhuman voice. As if it were in horrible pain. The storm stopped the moment we thought it had died. It had been living by us, remembering it. It wanted us to fear it. The activities we did after were trying to tackle each other with this random dagger-shaped piece of wood, climbing trees, and making a dam. It's the last time we've ever visited it. This happened 6 years ago. My sister and I decided to ride bicycles. We were driving through the forest and were already about to return home. On the left side of us were birches. My sister overtook me and was riding in front of me. Next, I saw her almost falling off the bike, swearing, and turning her head towards these birches. I did not attach any importance to this and was trying to drive smoothly. I almost fell and stopped too. The sister was still looking into the trees. I want to say that my sister and I felt the same thing. Do you know the feeling when someone stares at you? This feeling was just tangible. I turned around my head, and for a second my gaze was wandering among the trees, and then I suddenly noticed something strange. This creature was at a height of half a meter. It stood next to the trunk of a birch. It was invisible. At first, it looked like a cube full of dark clots. It wasn't big. It was something small. And incredibly strong. His energy struck me with its power and malice. It was tangible and seemed to press on me. I had no fear. As soon as I stumbled upon this creature, I began to look at him as if I were hypnotized. I had such a feeling as if there was only this creature, as if nothing existed. I forgot about everything, about my sister, about myself. I saw only this space where he was. All that I saw with peripheral vision was like a fog. My head was instantly empty, there was not a single thought in it. Nothing at all. Emptiness. I felt that he was looking into my eyes. I don't know how, but I felt it. And this eye contact probably lasted no more than 3 seconds. I kept looking at him. And then something terrible happened. My mouth opened without my knowledge, and I said the following words, "Masha, look, someone is staring at us from the forest." And only when I uttered this phrase did I understand its meaning. Now I'll tell you what my sister saw. When she almost fell and stopped, she also felt someone else's eyes on her. She turned her head to that very place and saw some kind of creature, the same height, exactly the same shape. It was a silhouette, shaped like a cube, something vague. So we really saw the same thing. It was looking at us with a smoldering eye. My sister, too, felt hypnotized, and her head was empty. And the first thought that came into her mind after the numbness was the thought of running away from this place as soon as possible and taking me away. Afterwards, she told me that she wanted to tell me that someone was looking at us from the forest, but she thought that I wouldn't believe her. And then I myself said the same phrase. She became incredibly scared. I felt as if these words that I said were taken from my sister. Her own fears were passed on to me. And this creature made me tell it. When I got out of the stupor, I started to panic. When we left that place, this gaze was pressing on us, as if I had a bag on my shoulders. It was unpleasant and hard for me. And when we climbed the hillock and drove on, this weight disappeared. It was noticeable. And I understood why. The creature was watching us, looking at our backs as far as possible, as long as we were in his field of vision. I asked on one forum what it could be. I was told that it was an inorganic being by Castaneda and my sister, and I just got into a tunnel that connects his world and ours. Ontario, Canada, suburban city park, age 12 to 14, at night, take a short cut through the lake trail with very few to non-existent light posts. At the corner of my eye, I spot a bright, glowing, or solid luminescent, not shining, white figure, not an orb, in the bushes or dense trees, about 8 feet to the left of the path. I keep walking, and it seems to move in the same direction as me. It looked like a figure since the leaves and branches outlined it at certain dimensions, although not clearly enough, of a humanoid shape. I was a curious kid and did not frighten easily, but what freaked me out initially was how soundless the figure was moving through the bush. I think I probably let out a shriek and backed away in fear when I fully comprehended the situation. The figure was gone as soon as I looked back in that direction. To this day, I find myself wondering if it was a mental distortion. Although I wasn't on any drugs and besides occasional sleep paralysis, I never experienced any type of hallucination in a lucid state and definitely did not have mental issues, or if it was a very silent human being wearing white glowing clothing, very unlikely given no sounds of branch or leaf crunching going at that speed, or if it was a so-called ghost or alien or some entity. I don't know. This happened in the lower mainland area of British Columbia. The area is pretty densely forested, with the exception of some walking trails. They're fairly popular, but not popular enough that someone else would be there at the same time as you. There is no cell phone service either. Anyways, an old boyfriend and I were the only ones there this day, and we had made it probably 5 minutes down the trail when we heard this obnoxiously loud, echoing mechanical noise in the distance. It's usually very quiet out there, with the exception of birds and the wind in the trees, so we stopped immediately to listen. It got louder and closer really fast. It's so difficult to describe what this noise was like. Extremely loud, like a loudspeaker. It sounded like it was trying to mimic the sound of a bird squawking or some Jurassic Park dinosaurs or something, but it was too robotic and mechanical to be anything living. Then this glowing red thing shot out of the tops of the trees, and by this time the sound was deafening. The color reminded me of a glowing red stoplight. It was about the size of a hand, but kind of triangle shaped. No wings or any other markings or features. It was darting back and forth from the treetops, landing on branch tips, then flying across to other trees with such speed and precision that I couldn't keep my eye on it. Then it started dive bombing my face, coming so close it almost hit me, then flying back up into the tops of the trees, then back down at my head, within literal split seconds. A second, and maybe a third, one of these things came out of the trees, and all started doing the same thing. It was hard to tell how many because of how loud and echoey the noises they made were. I could feel how close they were to touching me. My hair was literally being whipped around by how fast they were. It all felt extremely aggressive. My boyfriend had run back down the trail and had apparently been screaming at me to run the entire time, but I hadn't even noticed or heard. After about 30 seconds of this attack, they all flew straight up into the sky and away into the trees. I could hear them in the distance for a bit, then never again. This took place last year, at the beginning of summer. I was with my mom, headed down to my Nana's farm to visit for a weekend. For some context, she lives on a farm way back in the country, right at the foot of a mountain in rural South Carolina. It's a very rural, secluded area, so the roads are badly maintained and barely wide enough for 2 cars to pass one another. The houses are also spread out and set far back into the tree line from the road, so there's very little ambient light besides the headlights of a car. So my mom and I are driving along, her in the driver's seat and me in the passenger seat. It was around 11 p.m., and we're 15 minutes out from Nana's, deep in the woods, with the radio down almost to silence. We come onto this straight stretch of the road in a heavily wooded area, and suddenly this blur of a creature darts out across the road, right at the edge of our headlights. It was moving pretty well, but both me and my mom were able to get a good look at it and both agreed on what we saw. It was a fairly large creature, roughly the size of a person or bigger. Neither of us could make out the head, but we both remember it appearing to have a segmented body, my mom's words, as if it were emaciated and its ribcage was poking out. The reflection of light made it hard for me to tell color, but my mom said she remembered it to be dark, and she didn't see a face or hair. It had long limbs, and as it moved across the road, it didn't run the way a dog or horse would, with all four legs. The best word to describe it would be loping, using its front limbs to pull itself along, and it was moving considerably fast. We both said something along the lines of "What the hell is that?" as it crossed in front of us. As we got up to where it had crossed, I turned to look at it just as it reached the other side of the road and out of our headlights. And I swear on my life, it stood up and ran. It was not like a dog rearing on its hind legs, it was definitely bipedal. I immediately yelled that it had stood up, and we both started getting nervous. I honestly would have thought I was going insane had I not had another person in the car with me. My mom has always been a pretty level-headed person and not superstitious, but she was very nervous and made me agree to not tell my Nana about it to avoid scaring her, which made me recognize how serious this was. When I was a kid, we lived in Bandon, out on Seven Devils Road. At that time, there were lots of wooded areas. This was the 80s, so I pretty much did whatever I wanted during the summer. I would pack a backpack with jerky and a sandwich or two and go out and play in the woods until dark. I was big into Rambo at the time, so I had my survival knife, BB gun, canteen, and camo. I would spend all day digging hidey holes and covering them so I could pop into them, cover them with the lid I made, and hide out. I thought it was pretty awesome. So anyway, one day near the end of the summer, I hear my mom call out when I'm out there in the woods. Which was weird because our house was in the opposite direction from where the call came. So I hollered back at her, and she said, "My name, I'm over here." So I went towards the sound of her voice. This happened a few more times, and I kept following. At this point, I was getting a little freaked out because there was no reason for my mom to be out there that far in the woods. In fact, she hated the woods, so she never stepped foot into them. So I turned around and started going back the way I came. Then she called out again, but this time her voice was really angry, and it scared me silly, so I took off running. I heard her call my name a few more times as I was bolting back towards home. I was getting really tired from pushing through the bushes and undergrowth, and it sounded like she was getting closer. Finally, I made it back to the area I was really familiar with, and I needed a breather. I hopped into one of my hidey holes, covered up, and sat really quiet. About a minute later, the steps got much louder. Whoever was behind me was really close. They didn't talk anymore, though. I could see a little from the hole I was hidden in, so I was watching. Sure enough, I saw someone in a pair of boots and blue jeans pass by. Whoever it was passed by, and I stayed put for what felt like forever. When I felt like it was safe, I covered my hidey hole back up and bolted to my house. My dad had just gotten home, and I told him what happened. Being in the 80s, he told me if I was lying, he was going to whoop me silly, and I had to take him out to where I was. Sure enough, there were boot prints where I hid, and whoever had made the prints had doubled back and gone back into the woods. He called a few buddies of his, and they followed the tracks for a while but lost the trail pretty soon after that. My brother and I weren't allowed to go into the woods anymore after that. We moved soon after. The person following me isn't what freaked me out. What freaked me out was that whoever was calling to me sounded just like my mom. And what freaked me out even more as I thought about it as I got older was that whoever was calling me knew my name. I was going camping, somewhere out in Arkansas, I think. I was with my mom, stepdad, brother, and best friend. My mom asked me to get the trash for the night and throw it away. The pole where our trash bag was maybe 20 feet away, but even just 5 feet in front of me, it was practically pitch dark without a flashlight because it was late and everyone was turning off lights to go to sleep soon. I figured I would just run quickly and grab it.
I walked to the pole, but just as I got there, for maybe a split second, I saw something run at me.
It didn't come from the woods, it just kind of appeared in front of me. It was humanoid, with its arms sticking straight out. But it didn't have a face, hair, or clothes. It was just flesh. It didn't have any genitals either, not that it really means much. It disappeared as fast as it showed up, but it was there enough for me to process it and scream louder than I ever had. I just stood there in shock, with my first thought being that my mom would probably scold me for being loud. I grabbed the trash and ran back up and told my friend, who was thoroughly freaked out. I have never been more scared in my life. But weirdly enough, when I told my mom, she didn't seem that freaked out or upset with me either. I have tried to debunk this encounter a million times, but I can't think of anything logical. Also weird, as terrified as I was then, when I think about it now, I'm not really scared. Just confused. Does anyone think they can help me figure out what happened to me that night? It was about 5 years ago that I went to my friend's second house in Upper Pennsylvania, by the border of New York and near Long Island. It was late winter. The whole area seemed pretty eerie, especially in the winter. Everything seemed still, and it was very quiet. This area was popular for vacation homes, but no one was really home. So one day, we decided to go hiking. It seemed like a great idea because the place is all wooded, and it seemed like it would be fun. So when this happened, we were deep in the woods. I'd say about a mile. We found a straight trail going all the way through the woods, which were old railroad tracks that were ripped up. Now I don't know much about trains, but there was a kind of sewer nearby. There was a concrete structure and a pipe leading out of it. This structure was along a stream. No one was around except for one local fisherman. He kind of kept moving along the coast as our group got closer to him. We were with parents. One thing about this strange structure was that there was a big metal latch. When we went near the structure, the local fisherman told us to stand back and head in the other direction. Being stupid kids, we decided to take a look inside. Inside still scares me to this day. A very bony man with glowing red eyes was sitting in the corner. It looks like someone came to visit. His voice was unexplainable, like very deep beyond comprehension, but at the same time I could hear it. It sounded like some sort of sound illusion. A wide grin went across his face. We shut it and ran. The local fisherman heard our scream and came over. Our parents were shocked, and the fisherman gave us information. Apparently his name was Conductor Tom, and of course he messed with stuff like Satanism and devil worship. It seemed unreal, but I never went there again. The following 2 nights, I had bad nightmares, and I woke up with sweat around my collar. It was pretty wacky, and now the whole area is just as eerie. I lived far out in the country when I was a small child. One summer evening, when I was around 4, I was outside with my dad. We heard this noise coming from the nearby trees. Suddenly, this massive, dark, winged thing quietly swooped down and landed on the clothesline pole, some 10 feet in front of us. It was a great horned owl, and the damn thing was gigantic. I could tell this thing was well bigger than my 4-year-old self. It just sat there very still, staring at me and my dad with its huge, round yellow eyes. It then let out a loud "hot" and violently flapped its huge wings. It scared the living shit out of me. My dad quickly took me inside. I could hear that owl hooting its head off not far out in the woods all night long, and I hid underneath my covers with a flashlight and a toy sword. For a few days after that, I was much too scared to go outside and even look out or be near a window. This happened to me about 15 years ago, when I used to live in Park Ridge, Illinois. There was a lake not far from my house near a forest preserve called Below Lake, which was a popular fishing spot. There was a gravel path that ringed the lake, which is about a mile in area, and at the far end of the lake, there was a forested area, which went in a way, called Below Woods. I used to enjoy jogging around the lake in the early morning or late afternoon, just before the preserve closed. This one day, it was beautiful, sunny, and fairly warm, and I'd gotten to the far end of the lake, where the forest began, and really needed to pee. The outhouse was by the parking lot on the opposite end, and since I didn't see anyone fishing except right by the shallower end near the parking lot, where I saw a couple older guys, I found an opening in the woods and took the dry mud path about 20 feet in or so and looked for a tree to do my thing. I noticed how quiet it was in the woods, no birds, no rushing of cars from the nearby highway. I could almost hear my own breathing. I finished up and turned back onto the path when I felt a strange feeling like I wasn't alone, although I couldn't see anyone around. It also began to feel ominous, and the hair on the back of my neck started to stand on end. I took the path around a bend where a large pine tree stood and came around the corner to see something that had burned into my mind. About 10 to 12 feet down the path was something that looked all black, sort of shaped like an old-fashioned bedsheet ghost, touching the ground, and had no features I could make out, but it swayed to the left, then to the right, again and again, like a pendulum. I guessed it to be about 6 feet tall, maybe a foot or so wide, and very black, like ink. It made no sound whatsoever. After about what felt like minutes but was probably not even a minute, I noticed it was now closer than it originally was to me, though I don't recall seeing it move, and I know I didn't move. It had stopped swaying and was standing motionless. It took all I could to gather my wits, turn my back on it, and race down the path, hoping to find the opening in the woods I'd come in, which I did in record time. I was momentarily blinded by the sunshine outside the woods, but I kept running down the path, ringing the lake, not daring to look behind me, until I got to the parking lot and into my car. Only then did I look to see if it had followed me, but I, of course, didn't see anything. I had no clue what I had just seen, but I was shaking still and had to calm down a few minutes before I could drive. I did go back to Lake Below after that to jog a couple more times, but I never again dared to go back into those woods after that experience. This happened to my uncle. On Christmas Eve 1994, He was riding his motorcycle with a friend on their way home from visiting my grandparents, who lived in a small village. It had rained like crazy the week before, the bridge on the main road had collapsed, so they had to take another route on a dirt road around the hill. They had been riding for a few minutes through the dark forest when suddenly something happened. My uncle hit the brake so abruptly that they almost fell. Hundreds of monkeys were emerging from the bushes a few meters in front of them, making their way to the other side of the dirt road beyond the tree line. My uncle waited patiently until the last monkey disappeared behind the bushes. Just as he was about to start the engine, another monkey walked out of the bushes. This one, my uncle said, was unbelievably huge. Dark grayish and as tall as an adult. It was bulky, and it limped a little as it moved. It was walking upright, very slowly, towards the bushes. And suddenly, it stopped in the middle of the road. It turned its head around to look at my uncle. He said he had never felt so scared in his life before. The gigantic monkey stood there, still staring into his soul. There was a flash of intimidation and wisdom in its eyes that only comes with old age. And he could see that this beast knew that they were in its territory. My uncle could feel his friend shaking violently behind him. Okay, let me tell you that we are not really familiar with the Sasquatch or Bigfoot legends where I came from, so whatever this thing was, it was neither of these two. After what felt like minutes, the staring contest was finally over when the beast walked into the bushes to join its troop. My uncle waited for a few more minutes until he was convinced no more monkeys were showing up and caught them off guard before they took off. When they finally made their way out of the forest onto the main road, his friend went, "What the hell was that?" My uncle was sure that that huge monkey they had just seen was the leader of the troop. It was just trying to make sure that its troop made it to the other side of the forest safely. But what scared him the most was that it never blinked while staring at him. It still gives him chills whenever he thinks about the frightening encounter. And as soon as he got home, he called my grandmother to tell her that he had arrived home. He also told her about the beast. She said it might have been the spirit of the forest taking the form of a gigantic monkey. According to local folklore, the forest is old and home to hundreds of ancient spirits. He was lucky that he did not encounter the dangerous ones that the locals believed were responsible for the mysterious disappearances of people who had taken a shortcut through the forest. So it was around midnight, and I went outside to walk my dog. We live relatively deep in the woods, with no surrounding houses. I took a flashlight, like I always do, with it being so dark. At the end of our driveway, there is the main dirt road, which I always walk every night with my dog, Henry. The main dirt roads lead directly to a dead end, but with wood in the back. As I got to the end of the driveway, I looked casually around as well as to my left in the woods. Mind you, I didn't see anything. I headed to the right and started walking down the dirt road while my dog was going to the bathroom. As I headed back, I noticed something far into the woods, in the direction I usually look. A giant orange sphere. I was confused at first. I thought maybe it was some people having a fire, but the closer I got, the more I noticed it wasn't that. There was no movement in its shape or waves coming off of it. Then I thought maybe it could have been the moon, but I looked up in the sky and saw the moon there. At that point, I started to get very creeped out. Whatever it was maybe 10 feet off the ground and just stagnant. Not moving. There is no luminescence coming off of it. Just a giant orange ball of light. The more I stared at it, the more I noticed it started getting dimmer. A minute would have passed, and I would have noticed this was not something normal. Once I noticed the light completely dissipating, I panicked and ran inside. I cannot explain what I saw exactly. It didn't necessarily feel malevolent, but it also didn't feel good. Okay, this happened to me a while back, and though I've tried to find it again, I never have. I live in a trailer park, and right next to it is a wooded area with drainage ditches and such. I was walking through it one day, and I heard, ahead of me and to my left, what sounded like a little girl screaming. I didn't really take much notice of this, as in that direction there was another housing area. However, it did strike me as odd when I heard another scream from the opposite direction, on the other side of the ditch. I slowed down some and was considering whether I wanted to go any further when yet another scream occurred. Right in front of my face. I jumped backwards some, and I may have made a rather high-pitched noise, and I immediately turned around to make my way home. This was followed by the sound of a little girl's laughter from right behind me and the sound of something following me. When I looked over my shoulder, I noticed rocks and stuff being moved as if something were walking there. At this point, I was absolutely spooked and moved as quickly as I could to get out of that wooded area and to the road so I could run back to my house. The noises of whatever was following me kept up right until I got out of the woods and ran straight back to my house. Last year, I was doing a kind of last hurrah camping trip in the fall before it'd get too cold and snowy for my current gear setup. I was going solo into a valley, and I didn't really expect anyone else to be camping at my site because of how late it was going to be in the season. I had also planned to bushwhack and scramble up to a couple of alpine lakes I could see on my map, about 3 kilometers away from my campsite. Well, I got a little ambitious on my way to camp and did some side trips, so I rolled into camp pretty late. I was alone, as expected. I knew I didn't have a lot of sunshine left, and this valley had occasional grizzly warnings, so I set up camp and set off pretty briskly into the bush. There was a path for a while, but soon I was just walking through the woods with no trail towards the climb up to the lakes. While I was walking, I was very frequently calling out "hey ho," just in case of bears. About a kilometer away from the lakes, I suddenly hear a "hey ho" back. It was a woman's voice, and it was loud, and she sounded like she was right behind me. I turned, and there was no one there. I waited a bit, expecting to see someone come out of the bush, and there was nothing. I went up the climb and looked down into the forest, and I couldn't see anyone. I didn't spend too much time at the lakes because I was a little weirded out and it was getting much darker. I practically ran back to my campsite, just before it was fully dark, and thankfully a few other campers showed up. But they said they weren't the person in the woods, and they hadn't seen anyone when walking in, and part of the hike is a ridge, so they would have. To get to that part of the valley, you'd walk through the campsite or come over some very significant mountain passes. It was just so strange. Someone had found me out in the middle of the woods, and if they had hiked out that night, they did so in complete darkness. When I was young, I had the luxury of living close to several of my best friends. We lived within walking distance of each other, so it was convenient. One of my friends lived further than the rest but was next door to another friend of mine. To get to these houses, I had to take a shortcut through the woods, and I would emerge into this vast open field. At this point, I could see my friend's house off in the distance. I'd say it was a good 300 to 350 yards away. This field was actually connected to the road. It was technically private property, but it wasn't gated or secured. I had taken this path many times before. Sometimes just to get to this field. In the spring, it was truly beautiful. One day, as I always had done, I emerged from those familiar woods into the open field. This time, I noticed something was off. There was a pickup truck pulled up to the edge of the woods. I thought it was a little odd, but I guess it wasn't too out of place. As I walked up to my friend's house, I passed by it, eyeing it carefully. I thought about looking inside, but I didn't see anyone in there, so I didn't see the point, so I walked on past it. I kept a distance of about 40 feet in case someone was inside and was trying to catch me trespassing. A few days later, I went back to my friend's house and took the same route as usual. This time the small pickup was gone, and the vast field was as it always had been. Once I got to my friend's house, his mom told me a disturbing story. A man had driven his truck into the field behind their house, written a note, and ended up inside the truck. I'm so glad I didn't look inside. But I shudder when I think that I walked past a dead human being. So me and a buddy were turkey hunting at Kinter's Ford. I'd say about a year ago, and it was just starting to get a little late, and we were walking through some grass in a field, making some calls every now and then we started hearing like cat noises, kind of like kitten cries from the forest that we were walking on the edge of. We thought this was kind of weird and went into the forest to check it out, and we walked around for quite a bit trying to find what was making the noise. But it always seemed to stop when we thought we had a good idea of where it was coming from. We ended up doing that for about a half hour until we gave up. We thought it might be bobcat cubs or mountain lion cubs calling out to their mother, and that was why they kept stopping when we got too close, but we had no idea. So we're out of the forest, walking in the tall grass again, seeing if we could hear or see any turkeys when we hear the calling or crying again, but this time it seemed like the number of them had doubled. We got slightly freaked out, but we had shotguns, so we were too scared. And when we got close to the sound, it didn't stop, so my buddy Will. He told me to wait at the edge of the forest, and he was going to see if he could scare anything out. He didn't, but it ended up creeping me out quite a bit. So we thought if there was a possibility that it was the cubs of some big cat, we didn't really want to have to confront it, and we thought the calls or whatever the noises were would scare the turkeys away, so we started jogging along the forest to get someplace far enough away that the turkeys wouldn't be scared off. However, whatever the animals owed us which really kind of confused us. And the entire time this is going on, the number of animals calling continues to grow. So we decided that we'd set up a few turkey decoys and see if we could lure at least one of those who were making the noises out. At around this time, the sun was just starting to set. So we get all set up, and we sit there for, I'd say, about an hour. We're both kind of freaked out, me a little more than him, but we have our guns loaded just in case something were to attack. And after about an hour, the entire woods in front of us seemed to be filled with these animals. I mean, It sounded like there were at least 75, if not more, of these things out there. And we end up becoming a little too easy because it seemed like a few of them were getting brave, leaving the forest, and coming about a third of the way to us. But we couldn't see anything because the grass we were walking in was basically up to the middle of our chest. And by this time, it starts getting pretty dark. I'd say about 45 minutes till it gets dark when we hear this grunt and snort behind us, and instantly me and him spun around, both loading a shell into the chamber of our guns, and there was literally nothing there. I mean, this was loud. It was like a bull snorting and getting ready to charge us. There were no cows in this area at least during the time we were there, and that caused us to get really on edge. Now we start standing up, looking for whatever made the noise, when behind us we hear something really big jump. I mean, you could feel the weight of it hitting the ground, and we turned around just in time to see a shadow disappearing. And for whatever reason, we started to chase it, but when we got to where it was, there were no tracks or anything even indicating it was there. Then we get a call saying it's too dark and to come back to the truck and leave. So we pack up our stuff and start walking towards the truck following the forest, and the noises are still following us until we hit basically a right angle in the forest, and whatever it was would not continue past that point. Whatever it was literally stopped like it hit a wall. But the entire time we're walking back to our car, they continue to call out. You might think this is a joke or something, but honestly, I'm really trying to figure out what the hell those things are. So, last Friday, me, my girlfriend, and a group of our friends were at a house show, a very DIY music scene, on a decently sized property out in kind of rural Kentucky. It was going pretty well until my friend, let's call him Dude, had a mental breakdown or something. I had known this might happen. Dude was going through some shit for quite a while. We had a whole get together of our friend group a few weeks ago for him, but anyway, during the show, he said he was going to go to the bathroom and then just vanished. We looked for him for about an hour until, finally, we found him. He was sitting at the tree line on some rocks facing into the woods in the fetal position, upright, sobbing. We had found him because I heard him yelling something like, "I'm not a ducking coward." I should probably add that it was around 10 to 11 p.m. at this point, so it was pretty dark out. But as we approached him, I was filled with this overwhelming fear and, all in all, a feeling of unease and sickness. I pushed through it, though, because I was more worried about my friend. Fast forward to this morning, and Dude's girlfriend/friend messaged me, saying she was looking through her voicemail and found a voicemail from his number just saying hello, followed by what sounds like footsteps in the woods and crickets. It sounded nothing like him. I talked to her and our other friend more about it, and they both say they saw a tall, naked, pale person, human-looking thing, about 10 feet into the woods in front of him. I didn't see anything, but I heard shit. It was laughing, but like really deep laughing and breathing. Very sick-sounding breathing, like fluid in the lungs, and shallow breaths. I don't know how relevant it is, but Friday was the anniversary of his grandpa's death. Next week is another show in the same place, and I really want to see what's in those woods. Any ideas on what it might be? A few years back, I went camping with two buddies in the mountains near Lake Tahoe. We hiked for about 2 hours with our packs to a small lake and set up camp. All was normal during the day. I made some hot dogs and beans and then stayed up until it was dark to watch the stars. Once it was dark out, we hiked up to the top of a large boulder to get a vantage point to see the stars over the trees. I recall that there was no moon out that night because we could see the stars so clearly due to the limited ambient light. And we are pretty far out, so there is no background noise or light from humans. Once our eyes adjusted after half an hour or so, we could see all of the stars and even some satellites slowly moving in the sky. So after we are done stargazing, we head down to our tents, set up right by the lake. We have two two-person tents for the three of us. My two friends shared one tent, and I was alone in the other one. We set up the tents right next to each other on the same flat spot. I fall asleep pretty easily because I am tired from hiking and exploring all day, and because it is so dark, I like sleeping in the dark. However, at about 3:15 a.m., I wake up to rustling on the outside of my tent. In my half-asleep days, I'm not sure if it is just the wind or something else. I keep listening, and I realize that it is something brushing against my tent, and it sounds like an animal pushing its nose against the tent fabric and sniffing. The sound is coming from the side of the tent right next to my head, so I can hear it super clearly. At this point, my heart is racing, and I am lying frozen in my sleeping bag, hoping that whatever is outside will leave my tent and it'll be over. I think about calling out to my friends in their tent, but I don't want to startle or anger whatever is outside, so I decide to just keep lying still and hoping it will leave. My mind is going through every possibility, and then I finally realize what it is. When we had set up our tents earlier in the day, there wasn't much flat space, so we placed our tents very close to each other. Evidently, They were so close that when my friend was moving his feet in his sleeping bag, they brushed up against his tent, which was right near my head. So all along, it was my friend's feet moving around, and there was no animal or person outside. Phew. However, the weird stuff doesn't stop there, and I only realized that this next part was weird once we left the next day and I got home. I laid in my tent and tried to slow my heart after realizing the rustling was my friend. I was looking at the shadows of the trees on the walls of my tent. They reminded me of when, as a kid, a car would slowly drive down your street, and the headlights through the blinds would cast shadows that slowly drew across your ceiling. At the time, it made sense to me, and I thought it was just like when I was a kid. Considering I had just thought a creature was outside my tent, this seemed like nothing. It was a dark and moonless night. So what could that light have been? It was a very slow drawing light that had the shadows of the trees moving slowly across my tent walls for about 5 minutes. We were far from civilization, so there is no way it was a car or a flashlight from a midnight hiker because the light was so steady and slow moving. Could it have been a flare in the sky or a comet streaking across the dark, starry sky? I still don't know what it could have been, and I only realized it after I got home and left the campsite. When I was about 16 or 17, I had a friend whose parents owned property deep in a forest in the Ozarks, Missouri. He had depression and all kinds of other mental issues, and he wanted to get away. I asked him if I could go so I could keep an eye on him. His mom drove us up there, and I didn't know there was so much forest in southern Missouri. It went on for miles. When we got there, his mom left us with some bread, a bottle of tequila, and a huge bag of weed for 2 weeks. During those 2 weeks, we didn't have power. The generator was shot. We were running out of food, so we were in survival mode, and there were no houses for a very long time. My friend started going crazy. He would go out and wrestle farm animals, pull his father's guns and threaten to kill himself, or just disappear for a day at a time, leaving me by myself in this dark-ass forest. When he left, it wasn't so bad. It was peaceful most of the time. One of those times I was lying on the couch and I heard some kind of musical chanting in a high voice, so I looked out the window, and there was nothing out there. I walked out on the front porch and out into the forest. I didn't see anything. I thought about taking a walk down the trail to the lake. The lake was very old, very deep, and as clear as a bell. I got to the head of the trail, and something inside me told me to stay the hell away from the forest. I still hadn't seen my friend. I went back inside, ate a sandwich, and went to sleep on the couch. When I woke up, it was still daylight out. I sat up and looked out the window, and there was a man standing in the clearing in front of the trailer. He was naked, and he was obviously of Native American descent. He walked around the clearing once. I stopped in front of the trailer and stared at it for about 30 seconds. Then he retreated back into the forest, down the trail, towards the lake. When my crazy-ass friend came back, I told him to call his mom because I wanted to go the duck home. She came back about 3 days later and picked me up. I told her what happened, and she didn't sound surprised. My friends and I were in a local park last night. We were walking along a trail, and right away something was off. One of my friends has always seen the paranormal, and he was extremely uncomfortable. He was seeing figures and hearing footsteps throughout the extent of the walk. My other friend and I could not hear or see anything out of the ordinary, so we kind of laughed it off and said he was just scared, which I now regret. It wasn't until we sat down at a tree that things took a turn for the worse. Both of my friends reported feelings of cold dread washing over them that I did not feel and assumed was anxiety. And then my ghost-seeing friend stared at the tree line. I asked him if he was seeing one, and he said yes. I looked into the woods, and I saw it. It was a small, wispy figure. It had a white-gray coloration and seemed to be made out of smoke or mist. It was in constant fluid motion, inverting into itself as if it were barely visible. It would bend from just a smoke ball to a small humanoid figure. Not childlike, just small. And it would wave. I pointed at it and asked my friend if it was between the two trees. He said yes. I described what I was seeing. He said, "Oh my God, you see it too." We ran out of there after that. I felt the same dread my other two friends felt, and I could not shake the feeling for the rest of the night. It's all I can think about now. What was that? It didn't feel like a dead person. It didn't feel like a person at all. It also didn't feel mocking, but it felt like it was trying to act in a way that was abnormal for it. My friend and I both saw the same thing, and all three of us felt the same thing. I live in West Virginia, and although I live just outside one of the larger cities in the state, it's still a pretty rural area. Because of this, I've grown up very familiar with the woods and wildlife, and although I'm not exactly an avid outdoorsman, I do have some knowledge, and I'm not uncomfortable or overly afraid of the woods or most of the creatures living there. I live in a neighborhood with other houses on 3 sides of me, but in the backyard, approximately 50 yards downhill from the house, there are woods and no other houses in that direction for over a mile. At the time, my wife and I were separated, so I was staying at the house alone. One evening, I let the dogs out and noticed a pair of eyes right at the edge of the woods watching me. At first, I wasn't too concerned, as I assumed it was just a deer, which frequents the backyard because of our apple trees. However, after watching the eyes for a bit, they did not move at all, appeared to be about 8 feet off the ground, and were the wrong color for a deer's eyes. I took the dogs inside, got a flashlight, and returned. The eyes still had not moved or looked away, they were staring directly at me when I returned, which would be unusual for a deer. Whatever it was positioned out of range of my light, so I could not get a look at what it might be, and I did not feel like going down the hill to get closer because I no longer felt that this was a harmless deer. At the time, I believed it could be a predator, so I just went back inside, locked the door, and turned off the lights in the kitchen so whatever it was would go away. Where the story really began to freak me out was when I came back to the kitchen later on and discovered that the eyes still had not moved and were still staring at my, mostly dark, house. This isn't normal behavior for most animals, not even predators. If there was nothing to actively hold its attention for a long period of time, it should have moved on. Long story short, whatever it was stayed in that position, staring at my house all night long. I was unnerved enough that I couldn't sleep and kept a gun near me for the rest of the night. I would periodically check, and the eyes were there every time I looked until the sun came up. The next day, I found no trace of anything in that area. No animal tracks of any kind. This was definitely not at all normal behavior for any animal I'm aware of, and the fact that it left no tracks at all freaked me out even more. Fast forward until this month. We had a couple of heavy snowstorms this winter that knocked down some trees at the edge of the woods. Recently, it's been unseasonably warm, though, and I decided it would be a great time to clean up the backyard and get rid of those trees. There was a small shed just inside the woods that has been there since before we moved in, but I've never really paid any attention to it. It was dilapidated, and the door was off the hinges. I don't spend much time in or around the woods in the backyard, and it can just barely be seen from the house, so I had no reason to mess with it. Well, during the cleanup, I got a little curious about the shed and decided to take a look for the first time. To my horror, the walls, floor, and ceiling of the shed were completely covered with weathered old satanic symbols, and there were stains on the floor that were probably blood. I noped the hell out of there and ended up tearing the thing down and burning it along with the trees I was cleaning up. I haven't been back down to the woods since. Whatever was in the woods previously has returned, though. The very night I burned the shed, I saw those eyes again, and I've seen them frequently since. On more than one occasion, I've even seen several sets of eyes. So far, nothing has happened in the house, and whatever it is has kept its distance, but I'm very concerned now. I'm afraid to go near the woods or even out in my own backyard. Around the summer of 2012 to 2013, when I was about 13-ish, I spent the summer in South Dakota with my uncle from the middle of June to the middle of August. During my time, he and I had quite a few interesting adventures. Towards the end of my stay, we decided that we would go on one last hike. We had been hiking a few times beforehand, Yellowstone and Bear Butte, and figured we could squeeze in one more. He suggested going for roughly a 5 to 6 mile overnight camp or hike in Cloud Peak Wilderness, Wyoming. When we got there, we hiked for about 3 miles on trail before he suggested going off trail for a little bit. At some point, we came across an opening that had a medium-sized lake, a waterfall, and flat rock surfaces mixed with the surrounding woods. We decided to set up camp for the night near the rock surfaces, but still on soft forest ground. We set up the tent, a small contained fire, and hung up our food supplies to avoid any nosy critters. During the night, we heard a variety of noises. From twigs snapping, owls hooting, and one of the scarier ones, wolves howling in the distance. My uncle brought his 5th-generation iPod, the first one that was able to play videos and movies. He put on Star Wars, A New Hope. We're both people who can't sleep without background noise, and frankly, the background noises of the forest at night were starting to make me feel slightly unsettled. I fell asleep within about 20 to 30 minutes of the movie starting. When I woke up, the movie was over and the screen was black, but it was still very dark out, so I didn't know what time it was. Within 2 minutes of waking up, I heard a loud clicking sound. It was fast and rhythmic, but not repetitive. It doesn't ever sound the same as the last phrase. My brain jumped to the woodpecker immediately, but then I remembered that they don't peck at night. It seemed to be getting louder, my heart was beginning to race, and I was starting to freeze up. To my horror, the clicking sound started multiplying, now coming from every direction. Some were close, and some sounded like they could have been miles away. From what I could tell, it sounded like there were possibly 7 or 8 distinct areas where the sound was coming from. My uncle awoke to the uproar of the sounds. He froze as soon as he sat up. His breathing became heavy, and he was noticeably terrified. He's a big dude, and I've never seen him like this, so if he reacts that way, I definitely know my fear is valid. We both looked at each other in absolute horror and confusion. The clicking sounds are nearly hurting our ears at this point, but all of a sudden, through the sound, there was a gunshot in the distance, followed by a loud screech. The only way I can describe it was like a lion's roar mixed with a woman's blood-curdling scream. The air became still, and everything became instantly silent. The only sound remaining was my breath and the breeze. My uncle and I just sat there, shocked for what felt like hours, but was probably only 2 to 3 minutes. After we were able to gain some self-control, we decided the only thing we could do was go back to sleep. Obviously, that wasn't happening. So I laid there for maybe 3 hours just listening to the still silent atmosphere. Once morning broke, we packed up as fast as we could, not speaking a single word, and hiked back. We tried to remember the way in which we had gotten there, but for some reason, nothing looked familiar. We berated each other with questions, trying to maybe spark a memory. Nothing worked, and we couldn't recall a single detail of our hike beyond the point of being on the trail. We hiked for 6 hours, hoping that the direction we were heading was right. Eventually, we found some relief when we noticed the trail. We saw a trail sign and looked at it to try to figure out where we were. We were confused when we noticed that we were still 2 miles from where we parked. How did we hike for so long and still be 2 miles out when we only planned for a 5.6-mile hike? We got back to the car and drove home. Once home, we searched for the area where we camped, and we were actually able to find it. What I didn't understand was that it was 22 miles from where we parked, and yet somehow we don't remember anything about the hike. To this day, we don't really talk about it that much. We have some sort of unspoken agreement to acknowledge that what happened wasn't normal, and I think we're still to this day trying to process it. This was and still is one of the most terrifying and strange experiences of my life. I worked the graveyard shift in the NC Mountains. Working these dark hours kind of leaves me with limited time to occupy my time on my days off. Normally, I just go out driving, hiking, or walking in the dark if I don't have a video game I want to play or a movie I want to watch. With this hobby, I often come across unusual things in the darkness. This happened about 2 weeks ago. Well, it was my night off. I was getting kind of bored with laying around watching YouTube while my fella slept. So, like most weekends, now that it's getting warmer, I decided to go out for a drive. It's about 1 a.m. and cloudless, so I head up to the parkway like normal. It's bound to be a beautiful drive. Nope, it's closed. Well, dang. Where do I go now? I think. Oh, Pisgah Forest. I haven't been there since high school. Perfect, an adventure. And off I drive. It's about 3 a.m. By the time I get to the entrance of the forest, it's already looking pretty foreboding. The entrance is smack in the middle of a tourist tubing, ice cream, and souvenir haven, all brightly lit parking lots and cute signs. But the entrance is completely the opposite. It's a long, straight road with absolutely no lights, disappearing into the night. Only campers go up there after dark. I don't think much of it, it's nighttime, and of course it looks pretty scary. Everything looks scary in the dark. And up I drive. Everything was pretty normal for a while. I pass by turnoffs for picnics and campgrounds, all dark. But the higher I climb up the mountain, the more anxious I feel. Something isn't right. I'm normally fine at night, it's my time. But something just feels off. I keep pushing on. The winding road climbs higher and higher. The forest is all around me, thick and serene. The air is warm, and it smells so good and musty. The only light around is from my headlights. But I can't shake the bad feeling. I try to ignore it, thinking maybe it's because I can't see the moon, like when I go on the parkway. Yeah, that's it. It's got to be it. But as the climb gets steeper, the more scared I get. My chest is tight and becoming painful, but I keep going, just trying to ignore it. I'm passing the waterfalls, hearing the water roar out of sight. I should be relaxing. But I can't. After about an hour and a half, I noticed the turnoffs were few and far between. I haven't passed any in a while. The pain in my chest is alarming me, and I'm considering heading back down. Suddenly, I smell something unusual. You ever remember being little and your parents having that particular smell that you remember? Like a perfume or cologne they might wear that you immediately recognize into your adult years as theirs? Well, my dad was a factory worker and a smoker. So from a young age, he always smelled of motor oil, harsh metal, coffee, and cigarettes. It's an odd combination, but it's him. And that's the smell I smelled. In the middle of the woods, with nothing but trees and clean air around, I smelled my dad. It was subtle, but I got the hint. I need to turn my butt around and go home now. I drove onwards till I found a safe place where I could do a K-turn. Around a tight turn, I found a good spot away from the guardrails and initiated the maneuver. Right as I got my car straightened back out, I stopped dead. The smell of rot had flooded through my open window, and it was inches from my front bumper. Was a creature. It was crouched down, looking at the dirt. The body. It wasn't right. It looked like a big, hairy dog, crouching on all fours. But the legs. They were too long to be normal dogs. My eyes moved up to its head, a human head. Long dark hair, covering a face I couldn't see. But its eyes. I could see them. And they met mine. Red or oranges glowing back at me. My heart felt like it was going to stop, and tears started filling my eyes. I hadn't been this scared in my whole life. My heart felt like it was going to stop. And the horrible smell was suffocating. The creature started to move, and I don't know what happened. It was like my body flipped a switch. I wasn't thinking anymore, I didn't feel anything. I just stomped on the gas pedal, veered around the creature, and sped off down the mountain. I feel like I should have clipped it with my car, it was so close, but I don't remember recognizing that I connected with anything. I don't remember anything up until my phone rang, long after I left the forest. It was my twin. She felt like something was wrong and had been trying to get a hold of me for half an hour. I drove to her house and explained the whole thing. Waiting for the sun to come up. This has been one of the most terrifying experiences that have happened to me so far. When I was growing up, my parents had a place on the edge of town. One side was the neighborhood, and the other was hundreds of acres of woods. We used to go exploring the woods back there to kill time and build forts. You know? Typical boy stuff like that. I was probably around 13 to 14 years old at the time. We would never go too far because we were scared that if something bad happened, no one could get to us quickly. As well as the fact that we never told our parents where we were or what we were up to. So they wouldn't even know where to begin to look. Plus, cell phones weren't extremely common back then. One day, we felt extra brave, so we decided to go even deeper into the woods. Where we lived at the time, the best way to describe these woods was that they were super dense with a ton of underbrush, so you couldn't see out above or too far ahead of you. So it always seemed dark and very unnerving. This day was also misty and drizzly, so it made it extra creepy to begin with. We traveled what I would describe as maybe half a mile to a mile. Now I wasn't 100% familiar with the area, as we hadn't ever gone this far. So I knew of no paths, entrances, or roads leading into the woods. We picked a random spot and began cutting down smaller trees to build a fort. After a couple of hours, and being a typical narrow-minded teen, we decided to look around the immediate area for something interesting. I walked a couple of 100 yards and found a barely visible path. Of course, when you find a path, you have to follow it, right? We followed the narrow path through dense cedar trees. It winded back and forth for what seemed like an eternity. Finally, we came to a clearing and found an old, two-story farmhouse, as I would describe it. The treetops loomed over the roof of the house, making it seem much darker. Now, what do you think we did? Of course, we had to go inside. At this point, we were soaked from being out in the drizzly mist. I came to the door, which was already cracked open slightly. I opened it a bit more and peered inside. Nothing spectacular by any means. A few pieces of rotting furniture and trash littered the dust-covered floor. Parts of the floor were gone, and you could see into the darkness below. The whole house had a bad lean to it, so I didn't dare go upstairs as it could have very easily fallen over. Upon further investigation, we found a few old, handmade creepy dolls. The white fabric was dirty and tattered, they were made from it, and their button eyes had long since fallen off. The whole place just had this super eerie vibe. It was getting late in the evening by this point, so I thought we better go back. I left the house and started walking back on the path. 30 feet out or so, I checked to see if there were any other paths or a road leading to said house. I didn't see anything. As I turned to look back at the house, I swear I saw something move away from one of the second-story windows as the curtain was moving ever so slightly. I figured my eyes were playing tricks on me, so I didn't think much of it. We make it back home, and the next day I told one of my close friends about the house and that I was going to take him there. He comes over, and we head that way. I made sure to tell him about all the details of it during our trek there. We get to the path and are fixing the last bend before the house comes into view. Upon coming to the clearing, I couldn't believe my eyes. The house was completely burned to the ground. Nothing was left except the concrete risers it was setting on. No ashes, no still smoldering embers. Nothing. The ground was still wet from the previous day's precipitation. My friend looked at me in disbelief, as I had been pulling his leg the entire time. I told him no. I swear, it was here yesterday. I never saw any smoke that evening, which you could have easily seen from my parents' house. Being the young, curious individual I was, I had to figure out what happened. So I walked up to where the house was, and the only thing I found was one of the creepy, handmade dolls sitting in the middle of where the house stood. We never went back into those woods again. I still drive by those woods on a daily basis on my way to work. Part of me wants to go back in there and see what I'll find.